semester, I had the privilege of finishing my last two Doctor of Ministry dissertation committee chairman responsibilities, however you want to look at it. And I want to reflect on those two because they really say something about our mission, and a mission to me well done, to see that we are able to do what we are called to do as a school, and to give you some hope too, if you're depending on how far you're looking down the road. But the DMin can certainly do that. I'm reading from Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, but I couldn't stop there. I had to back up because there is a sense, you could say that the whole letter of Colossians is a reflection on Easter. All of chapter 1 is about the blood of Christ and the power of salvation that comes through Christ. In chapter 1, verse 19, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. And then in chapter 2, which verse 6 and 7 are viewed as sort of the main point of the whole letter. It's the mountaintop. Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. So walk in him is Paul's reference to discipleship. You're followers of Christ. You walk in him. A first reading to me seems like something's left out. So walk in him. How do you walk in? I can see walking in his shoes, or I would think walking in the direction he's going, walk in fellowship with him. And I think Paul's is kind of assuming we can fill in that gap, but we're walking in him as disciples, and we continue to do that. One of the mission, or the mission that we have here is really challenging Christian leaders to deeper faith in God. And that deeper faith in God will lead you to do what Paul is saying here, to have this faith that's stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel. The two students I'm talking about this morning are Robert Perez and Scott Laird. Both of them are first-generation Christians. Both of them were basically converted through a campus ministry. Bob, I call him Bob since I've known him since he was in college, but I think Robert's the more official term. Hi, Bob. Baseball was his connection. God used baseball for his calling. He loved baseball. He grew up in the rough side of East Los Angeles. East Los Angeles has several communities like Whittier and Montebello and East LA, all of them on kind of Beverly Boulevard. And in 1983, I started preaching for the church in Montebello while I was working on my doctorate at Fuller. And this is a community that 80% Hispanic, 10% white who are all over 80, and about 10% Asian. Across the interstate was a community that was 80% Asian. And so you had this, in fact, East LA was the second largest Mexican city in the world after Mexico City. If you went to the big marketplace, you would think you're in Mexico. People can live there and never speak anything but Spanish. I mean, that's this context. Bob grew up in that, really tough background, parents divorced, struggle, I mean, just a really tough situation, but he loved baseball. He was able to become a walk-on on the Pepperdine baseball team as a catcher. And while he was there, he got involved in the Athletes and Friends Bible study that Rick Rowland had been doing, and as a result of that, was baptized. And of course, the first thing he says is you need to connect with the church, and our church building was just right near where he lived. And so he connected there, and we got to know him then as I guess he was probably a junior or sophomore, junior at that time at Pepperdine. I started teaching at Pepperdine, so I had him in Bible there, and then he decided to come on here when he finished, and came here and did his MDiv, worked at Raleigh Church of Christ with Jim Moffitt as his mentor for 7 years, and then went back. Couldn't get a job in ministry. Part of it was these were mainly white churches that didn't have much of a vision for working with Hispanics, even though at the time he did not even know Spanish. His grandparents only spoke Spanish, and he only knew English. This is the dynamic that was going on, obviously in that community. So he decides to get a teaching license. He gets married, gets a teaching license, and teaches, and goes to Santa Paula, which is an hour and a half north of Los Angeles in the valley. Starts teaching there, starts working with the church there with another one of our grads, Dan Jolliffe, who was also in school with him at the time and came here and went back. And he just started a Spanish-speaking congregation. He started learning Spanish and started preaching in Spanish and just got really involved in that. So, and only a few years ago was able to retire from teaching in the public schools there now, and is now in full-time ministries preaching for the English congregation at the same place. Scott Laird was a student from Three Forks, went to Bozeman, Montana State, which had an incredibly active campus ministry in those days. And when he became a Christian, as he describes it, he went out on the streets the first day and just thought everybody needed to know about Christ. And didn't know that didn't always going to work that way, but he was extremely evangelistic. Went to Canada after he graduated, worked with the church, came back and ended up at Great Falls about 25 years ago. And as a result of that ministry, he has led his parents to Christ, his sister to Christ, and I don't know how many people. I do know this, that in the last, from 1995 to 2017, they had 317 baptisms at Great Falls. And this is a church that's near an air base, and so they have a lot of people going. In fact, during that same time, they had 419 members leave who were sent. They call it sending out, not leaving. They just were sent out because that's a transient group. But they only had 389 transfers in, so you can see there was a lot of growth that came predominantly through conversion. 53% of that congregation today are first-generation Christians. And when I think of the joys of the gospel and gratitude and the power of the resurrection and everything that Paul was talking about here in Colossians 2, 6, and 7, you can see how that thanksgiving and the power of the gospel and the resurrection continues to ripple through people's lives that are the least likely to do it a lot of times. And to see what God does through their lives, that to me has been really incredible. Now that comes to a doctor of ministry, because now both of these guys, having done their MDiv, have been in a doctor of ministry program to work in their local churches. Bob took on probably one of the most difficult projects you could possibly take on, because you have an English-speaking congregation and Spanish-speaking group, and his vision was to have a common shared eldership so they'd have one congregation with two language groups. The challenge to that was not only linguistic barriers, but doctrinal, cultural, historical, meta-narrative differences, and to work through all that to build the level of trust so you could actually have a shared leadership was a pretty big challenge. But he took that on, learned a lot, I think, through this process, and actually did develop a lot of trust. But he realized it could not be done through some kind of program, like a teaching program. Let's have a class for leadership and then appoint elders. It's got to be done through mentoring and through one-on-one relationships. And I would say just gutting it out one person at a time. Just gutting it out one person at a time. That's Santa Paula, California. Great Falls, Montana. Scott does a project in response to the need for leadership development. If you have that many people coming and going, and some of them who are coming there are really gifted people, but they're not able to stay that long. Although now more and more of those who come through the base are 20s, in their early 20s. And if 50% of the congregation are first-generation Christians, you don't have a lot of depth of examples and leadership, and so there was a need to develop leadership. So as he started the DMin project, he wanted to do it, and guess what? Let's come up with a program. Let's have a class. Let's get these guys in a class, and people who are interested, and hopefully, boom, we'll have some more elders and deacons that come out of this class. Then as he engages this a little bit more, or he engages his major professor a little bit more, realize, and I asked the question as I did to both these guys, okay, what class did either one of you take that led you to be an evangelist and a church leader today? They couldn't come up with one in spite of all the good classes we have here. But they could come up with people that mentored them. And I said, that's got to be the key. Unless you engage one-on-one. And you know, teaching class is kind of clean and sterile. Mentoring is as messy as it can be. You can't ever predict. You can't ever control. You just engage. As Jesus did with 12, he could never predict what Peter was going to say. The only one we do know he clearly predicted and knew was what Judas was going to do. But other than that, you never knew what these guys were going to do. It is messy. And in order to engage in some of the most difficult aspects of ministry, mentoring, you have to yourself become extremely vulnerable. And in both of their projects, the vulnerability was so obvious. Bob had to become more vulnerable in working with the Spanish-speaking group now because of some of these differences and struggles they had. Scott became more vulnerable because he let go of this leadership development, and it was a mentoring group, and now that became other mentoring groups, to where there was 26 key people within that congregation who were involved in 9 months of mentoring in groups of 3 couples at a time. So it was kind of beyond his control, as it were. He kind of started a group, then other groups started, and then a third round started. When I did the site visit, we brought these people together, the 25 people together. And it was really interesting how they talked about this. And this was the first time they'd actually had a reflective meeting since this project has been done. And the most common thing was they didn't like the idea. It's kind of like up too close and personal. Because in all of these groups, they simply told their story. But they needed help in telling their story, so he used Clinton's timeline, and he didn't use LEP language and stuff like that, but he used the timeline process that you look at your life and you go back and you see what God is doing in your life. And very few of them had ever done that. Very few could say, here, here, and here, it's clear God was working in my life. And so they didn't like it. After one of the meetings, one of the guys was talking about going home, and he goes, this is stupid. He hit the steering wheel. You know, his wife goes, but we ought to do it. I don't want to do this. And he was not going to do it. One of the other guys in the group, there's a group of 3 couples, one of the other guys had developed a relationship with him. He was an old-timer in church, and they developed a relationship on beekeeping. And through that context of beekeeping, encouraged him to go ahead and do it. It's going to be okay. No, I'll help you through it. Come to find out, he had been in Iraq. Probably had killed quite a few people. He didn't want to face some of that. He didn't want to tell that story. He didn't even want others to know that story. When he finally got the nerve to tell his story, it happened that one of the elders, one of those couples, the mentoring couple, was an elder. The minute he told him, he said, brother, you're forgiven. And it's like the weight of all that was lifted from his shoulders. Now, who do you think is one of the strongest advocates of telling your story who thought it was one of the dumbest things to do? But Scott wasn't even involved in that conversation. This is something that was just kind of turned loose. And now leaders have emerged. This guy has now developed a team for security at the church. And he was not that actively involved. And now he says, well, if I'm in security, I guess I need to be there all the time. And he gets actively involved. Another lady discovered her gifts in this story, how God had worked in her lives. And she's now kind of developed her own hospital ministry and actively involved in ministering to others. All because he got people, one, to look at their life story and see what God is doing. And the other thing, which I'm going to have to find a way to do it in my spiritual leadership class because I haven't done this, is they also need to share their story with others. It's in the sharing of that story that transformed a lot of people's lives. What was obvious, meeting with the church in Santa Paula and meeting with these people involved in this process at Great Falls, there was a level of joy and thanksgiving that none of them anticipated as they began this process. They had to do some tough stuff. What we're about is calling Christian leaders to deeper faith in God and to higher standards of ministry and academics and scholarship. And it's so vivid to me to see how that really happens on the ground in California and Montana and wherever else you may be ministering. I was reading a chapter from Peter Drucker's book the other day, and he has this interesting chapter of 3 things he learned from his mentors. He had 3 different mentors, and here are the 3 things he learned. And what was interesting to this list is this is exactly what happened in this DMin process with both of these guys. And I'll just reflect a little bit on one of 3 of them here. Treat people differently based on their strengths. In both of these cases, they were treating Hispanics and Anglos differently, treating people within these ministry mentoring groups differently based on their strengths. And it's amazing how the Spirit of God came out in that. Set high standards, but give people freedom and responsibility to do their jobs. Both of them will tell you, we kind of set some standards. We pushed both of these guys pretty hard, but it was up to them to work this out. We weren't tying their hands, but we were calling for, some higher standards in this. And then the third one was performance review must be honest, exacting, and an integral part of the job. And these guys both got some pretty heavy-duty performance review from their committee and from me. I don't think Perez has seen so much red ink in his whole life. And there was one comment of the original mentoring group kept saying, and when I met with them, they kept saying, before Huffard got involved in this, we were blah, 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 blah. But then they always followed up with, that was the right thing to do, but I was pushing them a little bit. And this was performance review. The lesson learned to me is, I think for all of us to be effective in ministry, we do need feedback, we do need mentoring, but we also need to tell the story of what God is doing in our lives.